Good evening and welcome to the continuing Facebook class from Lindsley Avenue Church of Christ for Wednesday, May 29th, 2024. This class is one of the last installments of the topic, Why I Believe, where we have been presenting the reasons why I personally am a believer as opposed to a non-believer. We started this class many weeks ago by looking from philosophy at the basic arguments for the existence of God. And what sets this approach perhaps a little different from many approaches that are used is it starts with simply, is there a God? And questions about the Bible and Genesis and the flood that we are getting into here at the very end are really, listen to me carefully, rather insignificant if you don't have someone that you are talking with who believes in God. There's not much of a point in going to Genesis chapter 1 if somebody does not believe in God to begin with. The Apostle Paul did that in the book of Acts when he was in Athens. He was speaking to people who did not likely know anything at all about the revelation from God to the Jewish people. They almost certainly had probably never heard of Jesus, and they were pagan. And so he does not start with, in the beginning, God created. That would not have done much to help the cause of discussing the existence of a creator, which is what he did. So we have been discussing all along the way leading up toward these questions here that I have called third and fourth level questions, because you've got to start at the beginning. Is there a God? If so, would God have revealed anything to humanity? If so, is it the revelation that's contained in the Bible? If so, well, doesn't science explain everything? And if not, what about the Bible and its relationship to science that is relatively established? So that's where we've gotten to here toward the end. Again, talked about the flood last week. The approach for these last couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at Genesis 1. Tonight, we'll be talking a great deal about the importance of Genesis 1, and it is very important, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll finish that up next week and also have a summary of the class. I do hope that the class is of some use to you. If you know someone who is having doubts about their faith, I'm hoping that you will share and point some of the videos and point them to these videos. We'll see about getting them up on YouTube at some point so they can be shared. Or if you simply have doubts yourself, use this as a resource and go back and look at the various topics and see if there's something that might help address questions that you have. But for now, let's go ahead and jump right into Genesis chapter 1. Sometimes it's asked, why does it matter what you do with the first chapter of Genesis? What difference does it make? Who cares, somebody might say, what Genesis 1 has to say? Well, I think that personally, that's a fair question, deserves a fair answer. Why is the first chapter of Genesis so important? What can we truly be certain about in the first chapter of Genesis? And so some of the ideas below are based on the work of an individual named Dr. Wilbur Smith, and I am indebted to the work he has already done. So several of the next slides are pulling from work he has done. Genesis 1 is placed at the beginning of the Bible to show mankind, to show humanity, number one, that the world in which we live originally proceeded from the creative activity of God. Genesis emphatically states it begins with, in the beginning, God created, and that rules out all naturalistic, non-purposeful explanations for where things came from. The world and the universe are here because of God's will. That's why we are here. Far from a fortunate accident, a series of very favorable, fortunate accidents going back into a dim past, this world has been specifically created by a personal, caring God who cares about humanity. Number two, that God alone, the one true God, is the creator of the world. The world proceeded from the creative activity of God, and we can know who that God is, and the Bible spells out who that God is. The one true God is the creator of the world. This world is not the result of any other God. Far from the prevalent belief at the times that this was given, roughly 1500 BC after the Exodus, the Bible records that the world was created by the one true God. When you compare the information about the origin of that world to the stories from the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and others, the differences are quite striking. The God of the Bible is the creator of the world. It's also placed at the beginning to show humanity that in creating the world, God reveals himself to be the eternal God of omnipotence, all power, omniscience, all knowing, and infinite goodness. He is the source of all power, all knowledge, and all that is good. By creating this world full of beauty, with objects of wonder, and with the ability to supply our every need if we don't destroy it, God shows his wisdom, his planning, and his care for us. He's already shown his personal attention, as we talked about several weeks ago, by the incredibly complex fine-tuning of the physical world and the universe that's required simply to allow us to even exist. In contrast to some religions that would have God as a creature that attained godhood, and there are some individuals and some groups that will put the label Christian on some of those beliefs, that as man is, God once was, things like that. The Bible, however, presents the world as the creation from the activity of a pre-existing being, a being that existed before calling the universe into existence. The real importance of that is time and space have a beginning with this in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so therefore, whatever this creator is that the Bible is telling us about is not bound by time and not bound by anything that is physical. Therefore, questions of, well, where did God come from are outside of our ability to explain, because that question is assuming a cause and effect relationship, a sequence of events in time. Time itself came into being. And so therefore, as much as you might want to ask those kinds of questions, they are not going to get an answer, because time came into being when the universe was created by God, as Genesis says at the very, very start of the book. It's also placed at the beginning to show humanity and to inform all of us of the noble origin of the human species and the exalted dignity that we always need to attach to the human race, because we were created in the image of God. There is no human being alive at all who is not worthy of that respect, that care and concern we should give to all. Why should we love everyone? Every single person is created in the image of God and has that imprint, if you will, of God upon their very nature. We exist to serve and glorify God and to love and care for one another. And that is what Genesis 1 tells us. Far from developing over time as part of a savage world in a long past, we are here because God created us. Unfortunately, so many times, as the Bible records and as we see in today's world, we in fact seem to want to return to some sort of savagery. Man is not an animal. Human beings are created specifically in the image of the Creator themselves. And as such, there are certain aspects of humanity that have to rise above a dog-eat-dog kind of philosophy. Now, I'm well aware humanity is a vertebrate, humanity is in the primate grouping. That's not what I'm talking about, saying that we're not an animal. We're not merely an animal. We are different, created in the image of the Creator himself. Generally, therefore, we care for the sick and the injured and have compassion on individuals who are less fortunate than other people do. Most of the worst episodes in human history have occurred when one group of people have ignored that dignity associated with another group of people by oppressing their neighbors. Think of the persecution of the Jewish people back during the World War II, for example. What's less certain about Genesis chapter 1? Well, by way of contrast, there are some things that prominent individuals within the church in the past have not felt were quite so certain when looking at the first chapter of the book of Genesis. This may be shocking to some, because some individuals who will talk about these very things present it as if it's a syllogism down to the very deep end, and there's nothing that we cannot be certain about, certainly not some of the things that these learned individuals who were hardly evolutionary individuals who were hardly theological liberals had some cautions about. So, for example, Batsell Barrett Baxter, in his book, I Believe Because, which was used as the Christian Evidences book at David Lipscomb College when he was teaching there. Here's a statement he made in the book. Number one, the exact details of creation are not revealed to us, but we can know that God did it, and that is the important thing. Well, what does he mean that the exact details of creation are not revealed to us? How exactly did God form the stars? How exactly did God form the moon? I mean, again, the entire universe, other than the earth, the sun, and the moon, are just kind of dismissed with the wave of a hand in English with 5 words. He made the stars also. You're not going to know how galaxies were set spinning and all this kind of stuff. So the exact details of creation, by definition, as it were, are not revealed to us. We do know God did it. We do know God did it. So he did believe that the exact details were not revealed to us. Some individuals would take issue with that. And I know Batsell Barrett Baxter took a lot of heat from making some of these statements, but he said, this is what I understand from reading the text. He thought otherwise. I do tend to agree that the important thing is that we can know that God did it. Remember, I've urged humility from a scientific perspective when it comes to looking at things in the past. Religion doesn't have a sterling record with that either, broadly speaking. And so from a theological perspective, how about we all try to exercise some humility instead of defining 1,001 questions that we must be absolutely correct on and agree in order to pass a final exam to go home to be with God. Here's what he also said. Rather than become dogmatically involved with any of the hypotheses of creation, it is well for the Christian to be aware of their possibilities and their limitations and to accept the Genesis account on faith. After all, it is the best account that man has of what happened in the beginning. We can never know exactly when God created our universe, nor exactly how he did it. Now, these hypotheses of creation are what we're going to talk about. These are the 4 views that we will be discussing in the rest of this class and the next class. I remember reading this to someone who was a bit more adamant that you could know, and the person disagreed. I would never want to sign my name to this. Well, I knew Batsell Barrett Baxter as a counselor at Lipscomb when I was there, and he had a great deal of humility about it, that he would have refused to kick somebody out the door by them not necessarily being able to come to a conclusion. Be aware of possibilities and limitations. And that's what I'm going to do when we talk about these 4 approaches to Genesis chapter 1. Here are some strong points, things that are in its favor, things it doesn't have any problems with. Here are some things you need to be aware of if this sounds good to you, that you need to have a way to answer or address. And so that's what we will look at. As I say, he made this statement after discussing several theories about the first chapter of Genesis. I would tend to agree with him here as well. Each theory relates to the evidence around us for how to approach Genesis 1, has some strong points and some points that are not as strong. Batsell Barrett Baxter would have had us be aware of their possibilities and their limitations. Now, let me say, if you don't know who Batsell Barrett Baxter is, you really should check out by Google and find out more about who this man was. A great, great man here from the past. Another individual, I've used him before, David Lipscomb, who donated the land upon which Lipscomb University sits. Again, hardly some theological liberal, hardly somebody who believed that man arose from evolution. He also felt that there were some things we would not be able to know about the natural world from a study of Genesis. Here's what he said in one of the books that he and Sewell wrote, Questions Answered by Lipscomb and Sewell. Here's a direct quote. I have no way of knowing how long the world was created before man was created. The Bible does not tell, does not say. It only says in the beginning, and that afterward he created the plants and animals and last of all man. But it gives no intimation how long the earth was created before these other things. One of the approaches would disagree with that, because it would say you can know exactly, plus or minus an hour maybe, how many hours after the creation of the world before man was put on the earth. David Lipscomb knew the text of Genesis 1. I don't know whether he could quote it from memory in the dark, but I believe, by and large, he almost certainly had a better understanding and knowledge of what the text said than many of us do today. didn't think that way at all. Now, he took this view actually after accepting something called the gap theory, which I myself do not believe, but my point is simply that this man who knew the Bible better than most of us did not come away from his lifelong study of Genesis convinced of specifics that today are almost viewed as a test of orthodoxy. If he were living today and were espousing these things, might get run out of town on a rail. While it is very true that I could easily present quotes from individuals who would take issue with Batsell Barrett Baxter and David Lipscomb, the point should be noted that individuals of relatively conservative standing have refused to interpret Genesis as specifying a great deal about how and when God created everything around us. I just want us all to remember that the next time we run into someone who is adamant that they know the answer for exactly how everything happened in the book of Genesis, especially chapter 1. Where did they get this knowledge that these individuals here in the past, Batsell Barrett Baxter and David Lipscomb, missed? What did they know? What did they know? And where did they learn it from that these individuals did not know? It would also appear that these men felt there were more important things to be concerned about rather than being heresy hunters, if you will, such as loving God with all your heart, loving your neighbor as yourself, spreading the good news, and all kinds of things. As I quoted before, Batsell Barrett Baxter said, "We can know that God did it, and that is the important thing." Now, let's get to what we were going to talk about here, some of the views people have about Genesis chapter 1. The first view, I have labeled this as atheistic neo-Darwinian evolution. This is the view of someone who's really not going to care what Genesis says, because this is someone who believes there is no God and that humanity came about through a generally accepted approach of evolution from earlier ancestors, descent with modification. So this is the, I might say a quote marks here, scientific worldview that certainly many evolutionary biologists are going to have. This is a non-God oriented view. This view holds that those who hold this view believe that Genesis is essentially a fairy tale and that it is the product of a primitive culture. Here's a very prominent professor, Professor William Provine. Modern science directly implies that the world is organized strictly in accordance with mechanistic principles. There are no purposive principles whatsoever in nature. There are no gods and no designing forces that are rationally detectable. What he's saying is that there's no evidence whatsoever that God exists. Everything is A to B to C to D. There are no principles that give any purpose to anything at all. Now, there are certain consequences of that. Modern science, therefore, really directly implies there are no inherent moral or ethical laws, no absolute guiding principles for human society. I said that back some weeks ago, that if you say there is no God, there are no absolute principles for guiding human society. One group of people decides that they want to kill anyone whose name starts with the letter M on a Tuesday and eat them on Wednesday. Sounds horrible. Personally, it is horrible to me. But modern science has nothing to say on it. You can decide what you want to do or don't want to do. There are no inherent existing moral or ethical laws, so do whatever you want to do, subject to governing powers and people that have police power and the power of the bully of being able to punish you say don't do. Nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong in the world. There's really nothing good either. Love is kind of an illusion. Number 3, the individual human becomes an ethical person by means of 2 primary mechanisms: heredity and the environment. That is all there is. So we learn right and wrong by either being taught it as we're growing up, or perhaps some people are a little bit more from a heredity standpoint inclined to be kind than others, right? But again, it's imposed. Generally speaking, it's imposed from the outside. Here's the other thing. We must conclude that when we die, we die. And that is the end of us. I remember seeing a show on television where he was asked about that, and he had a brain tumor at the time. And he looked in the camera and said, "That's what science tells me." So someone who has this viewpoint, what do you mean Genesis 1? Who cares? Now look at this one too. Free will simply does not exist. There's no way that the evolutionary process is currently conceived can produce a being that is truly free to make choices. If I am not free to make choices, you can hold me accountable for the choices that have been made, but it's not my fault because I could not make a free choice. Therefore, when we have people in prison and doing this kind of stuff, it is more the power of the bully to impose the will of another group of people on somebody who's making choices they are not responsible for. That's the implication of view one. And to me, that's one of the stronger arguments for why this is just not possible. You have to completely give up all approach for there being anything that should never, never happen. That's not a very theistic worldview. In fact, it's not a theistic worldview at all. But that is one view that people have out of four. And this is, unfortunately, a very widespread view. There may not be people who are aware of the implications that Professor Provine lays out right here, but this is the view that science gives. So if we're going to put science up on the pedestal and have that as our worldview, all of these 5 points here are correct. Old Uncle Bill dies, the end of Uncle Bill. Why should I worry about it? Because he was just the bag of molecules making choices based on chemical signals operating in his body. There's nothing else. Rather depressing. View one. View two, theistic, non-Darwinian evolution. This view, those who hold this view believe that God used biological evolution to bring about the various life forms that have existed in the past from more primitive ancestors. Many who hold this view, and again, I am simply explaining the view, many who hold this view would generally not believe that Adam and Eve were in fact the first people, but that God chose two human-like primates from the primates living at the time, sometime far, far in the past, gave them a soul and awakened some form of consciousness and turned them into humans. Strengths of this view. Believe it or not, there are some strengths of this view. This view does not conflict with any branch of science, including biological evolution. So if you were trying to, if this was a person with this view was having an argument with someone who was with view one, who the Darwinian evolutionist, they wouldn't be able to have any disagreements at all, although they would be ridiculed as creationists by the Darwinians, Darwinists, for bringing God into the picture at all. But there would be no scientific disagreement. Anything that it's a textbook said about evolution, any branch of knowledge about the past, person here in view two would say, yep, all good, all good. Oh, by the way, God did intervene in history and created Adam and Eve by giving them a soul and a consciousness and began the long road up toward all of humanity as it exists today. Professor William Provine, mentioned him on the last slide, he insisted that people who managed to retain religious beliefs while accepting evolutionary biology, and I have some friends who do that, have to check their brains at the church house door. In other words, if you want to believe in religion, when you understand evolutionary biology, you take your scientific brain that you use to operate most of the week, put it in a box, and then go in and have your fairy tale when you go into the church building. And when you're ready to become a thinking being again, put your brain back in your head. It really is that hostile view toward those who would say, I believe in evolution, but I also believe in Christianity in whatever form this is. Problems of this view. We said that the view has a lot of strengths. There's no scientific contradictions at all other than ridicule from those who say, how can you possibly have any belief in God? This view accepts evolution as fact, when in actuality, the mechanisms for evolution to bring about past changes in life are as yet unexplained and perhaps unexplainable. We talked about that a little bit when we looked at evolution. We didn't go into it nearly as deeply as we could have, but it's as if it's caving into the belief of evolution when it's still not shown beyond any kind of shadow of a doubt. What are the ancestors of these major potential changes from fish to amphibian, from amphibian to reptile, and reptile to bird, and reptile to mammal, and all these kinds of things? How do these mutations occur that get passed on, where you have to have, where are all the fossils? How do the mutations occur? How does this actually work? The person who's in view two has said, well, I'm believing it's working, and in my opinion, is doing it way, way too early compared to where the state of the knowledge is today. This view does also rather strongly conflict, it appears to me, with the early chapters of Genesis. How do you deal with this problem? Well, essentially, you view the early chapters of Genesis, usually chapters 1 through 11, as poetic or an allegory rather than recording actual physical history. But there are several consequences of this view that are important. People holding this view typically will believe that the flood recorded in Genesis chapter 6, the flood when Noah was here, really never occurred. It wasn't an actual past event. There would not have been a Tower of Babel, all these kinds of things. In fact, the first historical, and I even have that in quote marks, individual in the Bible, according to this view, generally is thought of as Abraham, roughly 2000 BC, although where that first historical event occurs may vary from person to person. However, this approach makes it very difficult to determine, looking at the text in the book of Genesis, why the events of Abraham's life are considered historical, but events preceding Abraham are not historical. After all, there's no marker waving in the middle of the text that says, here's where it all starts, sometime around the birth of Abraham. So there are some issues. You have to make some approaches to deal with the early part of the book of Genesis if you take this view. But science-wise, no conflicts at all. Once someone begins viewing the events described in the Bible as only occurring as stories or legend, you got to be real careful, because I don't want to appeal to the slippery slope, but here it probably is relatively true. That attitude that these are just stories or legends can carry over to other events in the Bible. We see that sometimes now with the conquest of the land of Canaan by Joshua. Did that ever actually happen? The Bible says it did. And so someone that's a theistic evolutionist may, in fact, not view that as historical. There's all sorts of concerns with this, right? So, conclusion. To me, my opinion, remember, this is why I believe, so it's only what I think. This view makes compromises that seem unwarranted. To me, in my opinion, there are no good reasons to view the account of the flood as mythical, other than the kind of incredulity and unbelief that many in the world today would greet such a miracle. Someone who believes that God created the universe from nothing should not have a problem with other miracles. And so I really truly believe that this viewpoint creates more problems from a theistic viewpoint than in any way it would solve from a scientific viewpoint. Now, bottom line question. If somebody disagrees with me, it may be here. Can someone who is a theistic evolutionist be considered a Christian? Well, in my opinion, yes. Stop the hate mail, please. Let me explain. The test of who is a Christian is whether an individual understands that they are a sinner and believes that God sent his son to pay the price for their sins, and then who then obeys the gospel. While you and I may not be able to personally understand how someone can have this viewpoint for the early chapters of Genesis, why someone can accept evolution as an explanation for where humanity came from, nowhere in the New Testament, nowhere in the interaction that God has had with people, calling them to become members of his family, is there any kind of litmus test that I have been able to find about whether that person can become a Christian. Remember, in Paul's writings to the Corinthians, he calls them the church of God. He refers to them as brothers and sisters. And yet, when you go look about food offered to idols, there are individuals in the church who still think an idol is something. You can't have that worry about things offered to an idol. Somebody still thinks an idol has some kind of power. An idol is something, and yet he's called them brothers. I personally can't take this kind of viewpoint, but that, while I would still want to talk to this person, I'd want to be investigating why you really think evolution happened and why you think this is non-historical back in the early part of Genesis. I'm not minimizing that at all. The relationship an individual has with God is between the individual and God. And if that individual is conscious of their sinful situation, and that individual understands they're a sinner and believes that Jesus came into the world, lived the perfect life, that he died to pay the price for their sins, and they repent of their sins, turn their life from wrong to right, and they then obey the gospel by being immersed to die to their old way of living and be raised to walk as a brand new creature. I am not the judge, and I don't really want to encourage other people to be the judge about their eternal situation. Remember, I don't believe in view two, but I have yet to see why someone can't, at the bottom of the slide here, meet these qualifications for becoming a Christian. How many times have those who have baptized people gone down a list of 100 things that we believe somebody has to understand and believe before we baptize them? We don't ask people, do you believe Noah was a historical person? Do you believe Moses was a historical person? Do you believe that Joshua actually interacted at the city of Ai or A? We don't ask that kind of thing. We assume that they understand things in the Bible, but we ask them about their sinful condition. So I know it's a little bit of a soapbox, but in my opinion, and that's all it is my opinion, the test of who is a Christian is presented here at the bottom of the slide. Sorry about that. Hope it didn't rile a whole lot of people up. I don't tell people, hey, go be a theistic evolutionist, but from the perspective of this class, someone who says, I'm not sure there is a God, I will take somebody getting to view two who believes God is real. I can talk about these other questions over time, and I have done that in the past. View three, this one may be a new kind of a view or approach to the question of the natural world in the book of Genesis. It's called Old Earth Creationism. And it's called Old Earth Creationism in contrast to view four, which is probably more familiar to many people of a young Earth creationism. So what's going on here? Old Earth creationism, the third major view of the first chapter of Genesis, is that it describes the creation of the universe, the earth, presently and formerly living life forms, but that this creation, notice that word, this creation took place over long periods of time. Someone holding this view would probably agree that the universe is 15 to 20 billion years old. Scientists think that it's less than 15 billion years old now. What's a few billion years among friends? And that the moon and the sun are 4 to 5 billion years old, and that man and dinosaurs never lived at the same time. The primary basis for this view about the earth being old is scientific evidence from many disciplines for a very old universe. Somebody believing this believes that the world is old, the universe is old, but is not buying into biological evolution. This is the big difference between view two and view three. Those who hold this view do not accept the theory of biological evolution. Strengths of this view. Those who hold this view, they don't have any conflicts with the scientific disciplines regarding the age of the universe of the earth. If somebody dates a rock formation, looking at the Grand Canyon, looking at the bottom of a stream, looking at a limestone formation and says, this is this old, this person could easily be working right alongside them and say, I do think you're correct. Someone who holds this view would agree with many of the conclusions from the scientific disciplines about the age of the earth and the universe. I know someone who attends church services. I know this individual relatively well, who did studies of the Big Bang. So someone who would hold this view might very well believe in the Big Bang as the method God used to bring the universe into existence. Essentially, this view proposes that God created everything that exists and spread that creation out over long periods of time. Someone who holds this view might very well believe that the evidence for the Big Bang from approximately 15 billion years ago, such as the cosmic microwave background radiation, is, as it were, the remnant of God's initial creation event when God said, let there be, right? This view would hold that about 10 billion years then passed before the sun and the earth came into existence. This view would also hold that it points throughout the history of the earth, God created different animals and plants that appear in the fossil record, and that these animals or plants served God's purpose in preparing the earth for humanity's future use. And then in many cases, those plants or animals may have gone extinct when their purpose was accomplished. And it would be God's purpose that someone who holds this view might very well never be able to explain. It's not as if the Bible would explain that part of it. What's the problem with this view? Well, this view requires a reading or an interpretation of the text, primarily of the first chapter of Genesis, to allow for long periods of time during the creation. The difference between this view and view two is view two required Adam and Eve to have been the result of a long line of evolutionary development. Not so for someone who would hold view three. They would believe God did, in fact, create Adam and Eve, and that the events in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis are historical, unlike what I suspect most people who would hold view two for theistic evolution would say those are not historical. And so the problem, if you will, that they have in coming to this view is they've got to figure out, what do I do with the apparent reading, or the reading, the words as they are in Genesis chapter 1? This is necessary because someone holding this view does not believe that the earth and the universe are only several 24-hour days older than humanity. So therefore, the days, as we read them in Genesis chapter 1, could not have been successive normal length 24-hour days. Some people consider this viewpoint, this issue, a direct challenge to the integrity and authority of the biblical text. One writer went so far as to accuse those who hold this view as having put their souls at risk. And obviously, therefore, this causes some people to react very strongly to this view. The question is, of course, does this view really challenge the authority of the biblical text, or is it an acceptable interpretation in light of further discoveries made by scientific advances, such as the biblical interpretations of the movement of the sun, how they were changed after other scientific advances? Remember, before the time of Copernicus and Galileo, the church, as it existed at the time, had taught that the earth was the center of the universe. The earth never moved, based on statements out of the Bible, and using language that we would use today, but very few people believe that the earth is stationary and the center not only of the solar system or the universe. People back in the 1500s who had that viewpoint were considered as spouting heresy. Today, that's what we are all taught in class in the second and third grade, and no one thinks a thing about it. So which is it? Well, many immediately accuse those who hold this view as having compromised with the evolutionists. In fact, they would like to get a broom, as it were, and push view three back over into view two and say there's really no difference between someone who holds view three, old earth creationism, and the theistic evolutionist. I consider that probably very, very unfair, regardless of the belief that different people may hold, because as you saw, the people that hold this belief state categorically they do not believe in a biological evolution. And so it's usually a tactic to make the person start trying to explain themselves. I consider that very unhelpful to try to come to an understanding of what different people think. So how do these people deal with this problem? Someone who holds view three, what do they do with the first chapter of Genesis? One attempt, which happens to be the attempt that I can tell that David Lipscomb held, was called the gap theory. This view asserted that there was an immense gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, within which all the prehistory of the earth occurred. This theory asserts that when Genesis 1:2 states that the earth was without form and void, that it could be read the earth became without form and void through some sort of immense catastrophe. The problem is that when you're reading Genesis 1:1 and you go to Genesis 1:2, this approach, reading that into the text, appears very, very unforced and perhaps even unwarranted, not to mention there's no scientific evidence of some sort of catastrophe of this sort, despite the fact that, as near as I can read, this is the viewpoint that David Lipscomb held. It's also apparently not in any way intending to slander, but you can read his works and you'll find the quote. Gus Nichols apparently also held a view similar to this. Other attempts to deal with this problem, some people fall into a category of what's called the day-age theory. This theory asserts that the days of Genesis 1 actually represent long stretches of time or ages. These are usually not interpreted as distinct long periods of time, because if you have the day in Genesis 1, there was evening, there was morning. We're not talking about a 1 billion year-long day where light is on the earth, and then a billion year-long night or one day. For one thing, with the earth being round, it would have been, you'd have to have the earth not rotating for that to occur. or something. I don't know. That's usually not what's being talked about. They're not trying to say that day 4 in the book of Genesis is a billion-year-long day with the earth stationary, so 500 million years of sunlight on half of the earth. That's not what it is. Usually this simply assumes that the days were long periods of time that could have overlapped. And this view would hold that God created everything that used to exist that you find in the fossil record without using any form of biological evolution. The primary problem of this view, similar to the gap theory, is that there's really no reason to look for this interpretation into the days of Genesis as long ages, except for external scientific evidence. But as we talked about, people that hold this view would say that's exactly the reason people reinterpreted what they had seen in the Bible with regard to whether the earth was the center of the universe. It's hard for us today to really grasp what a problem that was 500 years ago, but it was an incredibly tough problem for science and religion to work out. A third option, I'm just presenting the different options that those who would hold this view might hold, is the days of divine fiat theory, or the days of revelation. This theory asserts that the days of Genesis 1 were in fact normal days, but that these were the days in which God spoke about the various aspects of creation, which then took as long as they needed to come about. So sometime in the very past, God said, let the earth produce. And that when he's speaking this, that might have been a 24-hour day. And then there's, again, a long period of time where after God spoke, when God speaks, it's as good as done, even if it takes a while for it to occur. And so all the consequences of God speaking may have taken long periods of time to actually come about. This view holds, as I said, that when God states something, it's as good as done right there. That makes much of Genesis 1 similar to the way parentheses work to explain how something works, such as how those parentheses further explain the meaning of this sentence. In other words, let there be light, parentheses, and there was light, right? All this kind of stuff. And so God speaks, that's in some 24-hour period, and then the consequences, however long that took, don't really care how long that took, someone would say, that can take as long as it needs. God revealed it on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. God's decrees would be considered accomplished when he spoke them, even if it takes immense periods of time for it to actually complete. This view would hold that God created everything that used to exist, again, without any form of biological evolution. What's the problem here? Shock. Is that there's really no need for this kind of a viewpoint other than external scientific evidence. That's the reason anybody that holds view 3, and to an extent even view 2, the theistic evolution, is taking that view is because of the being convinced of the external scientific evidence, much as 500 years ago, people eventually gave up the geocentric view of the world from a biblical standpoint because of external scientific evidence. The fourth view, this one's a little less known, widely known. It's called the framework theory. This theory asserts that the days of Genesis 1 are allegory, not meaning false, but that they were simply a tool, a framework that was used to explain the creation to the people of Israel gathered around the mountain as Moses is bringing down the law and bringing down God's revelation. It's not saying that the creation is a myth, not at all, but that it's more of a poem trying to relate the incomprehensible, the fairly incomprehensible acts of creation in terms that people of all ages have been able to understand. A creation hymn, we hear that sometimes. I know I have heard it sometimes. And immediately some people will go and think, well, you're just trying to make that fake. It's false. It never really happened. That's not what the people who would hold this view would tend to suggest. Some hold this view, hold that there are 2 triads, groups of 3 days in creation. And if you see that, you'll kind of see what they're describing with the framework. Days 1, 2, and 3 establish domains: sky, water, land. Days 1, 2, and 3. Sky with let there be light, hovering over the face of the waters, and the earth. Sky, water, land. They establish the domains or the regions, if you will. And then days 4, 5, and 6 fill those domains with rulers or inhabitants: fish, land animals, humanity. I'm sorry, sun and moon. It happens when you talk out loud sometimes. Sun and moon in the sky, fish, and then animals and humanity, 4, 5, and 6. Don't write me up on that one either. So as I say, day 1 is concerned with the sky, and day 4 places the sun as the ruler in that domain. Day 2 is concerned with water, and day 5 fills the water with moving creatures. Day 3 is concerned with land, and day 6 provides land animals and humanity. There is certainly this Hebrew parallelism that we see all the time later in the Bible. And so this view would say Genesis 1 is doing the same kind of thing to give people a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 way of keeping everything parallel. Generally speaking, those who would hold this view would agree with the historicity of Adam and Eve. They agree with the historicity of the fall of man. The problem, however, this view can create is, when does the poem end? How do I know when this poetic viewpoint stops and actual history of events occurs? You know, that was a problem with theistic evolution. If you would view Genesis 1 through 11 as not real, that it was very much allegory, and then Abraham suddenly is real. How do you determine when the non-real and the real begins? That can also be a potential problem here. Conclusion, the ancient view of creation, all of these 3 views, whether it's, of course, view 1 we are dismissing, understand that. But view 2 and view 3, these kind of viewpoints are the choice of those who were convinced that the scientific evidences for the age of the universe and the earth are conclusive. No one's going to hold view 2 or view 3 really without concluding that the weight of scientific evidence that's out there for things being old is, the burden is just so high on that there's no way they can refuse it. The other option, I guess, is to conclude the Bible is not correct. And I would never want to encourage that for someone. And so they are taking these views in order to deal with the first chapter of Genesis or early Genesis and interact with the physical evidences for the age of the universe, age of the earth, in the same way that the viewpoint changed 500 years ago when it became obvious that the earth was not the center of the solar system, center of the universe, but that the earth went around the sun. And the interpretation of passages that would seem to suggest that the earth stays firm, never to be moved, weren't actually meaning what we thought they had meant throughout much of history. There are some unresolved problems for those who are making this choice, as I say, primarily in the area of interpreting the first chapter of Genesis. You've got to decide and think, how do I approach this? What do I do with that? However, these problems, I will caution us all, these problems were not considered severe enough by earlier preachers and writers, including some who were well known, David Lipscomb, Batsell Barrett Baxter, to make these views unacceptable, certainly not to make someone holding these views a pariah, a heretic who ought to be sought out and kicked out of our fellowship. As long, I would say, as the historical nature of events in the Bible is not compromised. It's tough to know what you do with someone who says Abraham was not real or Moses was not real. Why would you take that viewpoint and then say Jesus was real? So again, I know that's a little bit of my opinion, but I don't understand how that would work. But I am not the judge. God is the judge, and it's that interaction of the person with God and their statement of faith that they make to any of us, if we are asked, if they want to tell us what they believe, that's the important point in that relationship. All right, next week, sorry for the long-winded class tonight, we'll look at that 4th view, which is going to be recent creation, the one most of us are familiar with. We'll look at the 4th view and look at some of its strengths and some of its concerns or problems, if you will, and then we'll have a summary of the class. Listen, I'm so glad that you have taken the time to join us in this class. I hope that some of the things we've been talking about are going to be helpful. Please keep these things in mind when you run into someone who is having doubts about their faith. Thank you for joining us. Hope to see you again next week.